November 29th, 1945. At a small American holding camp outside Baltimore, 29 German women stood in a ration line with their hands tucked under their sleeves. They were waiting for bread, maybe soap, maybe another cup of thin coffee. Instead, the nurse placed a white folded packet into each woman's palm. No speech, no punishment, no warning, just a soft rectangle wrapped in paper. One woman turned it over as if it might hide a blade. Another lifted it to her nose, frowned, and whispered in German, "What is this supposed to be?" Lotte Weber, 37 years old, a former factory clerk from Hamburg, held the packet between two fingers. She had survived air raids, hunger, party slogans, and 3 countries of retreat. But this small white object frightened her more than the soldiers at the gate, because nobody had ever given her something like this before. Not her government, not the factory clinic, not the women's office that preached sacrifice from clean desks. The enemy had noticed a need her own nation had trained her to hide, and in that moment, before she even understood what she was holding, Lotte felt the first crack open. Not in the paper, in the world she had believed. 5 days earlier, the women had arrived in the dark. A truck carried them from the rail yard through low Maryland fog, past warehouses, black trees, and a fence strung with floodlights. They had been told what Americans did to prisoners. They had been told the camps were meat sheds, that guards laughed at hunger, that German women would be shamed, starved, or used for revenge. So when the truck stopped and the rear gate dropped, nobody moved. A sergeant stood below with a clipboard. He looked tired, not cruel. He called each woman by name, not by number. That detail was the first thing Lotte could not explain. The second was the barracks. They were plain, military, and ugly, but clean. The coal stove was already lit. The bunks had sheets. The blankets were rough but dry. A tin wash basin stood near the door. There was soap beside it. Soap. Several women stared at it as if it were silver. At roll call, a young interpreter said the rules slowly in German. No crossing the fence, no fighting. Medical complaints should be reported to the nurse. Letters home would be processed twice a week. Meals would be served on schedule. Then he added, "If something is broken, tell a guard." The women waited for the insult after that. None came. That first night, supper arrived in metal trays. Beans, a slice of bread, carrots, meat from a can. Coffee so weak it looked almost clear. But it was hot, it was enough, and it arrived for all of them. Frida Klein, a seamstress from Cologne, cried while eating. She tried to hide it by bending over her tray, but the woman beside her saw the tears fall into the beans. "I am not crying because it is good," Frida whispered. "I am crying because I stopped expecting enough." Lotte did not answer. She was watching the guards. They did not shout. They did not shove bowls through a door. They did not laugh when a woman asked for more water. One guard even came back with an extra ladle for an older prisoner, whose hands shook too badly to carry her cup. It was not friendship. It was not tenderness. It was discipline with limits. And somehow that made it worse. A cruel guard could be dismissed as an animal. A decent enemy required thought. By the third morning, the women had learned the camp sounds: boots on frozen gravel before sunrise, coal splitting inside the stove, the whistle from the rail yard, the church bell from a town they could not see, keys at the infirmary door. They had also learned something more dangerous. The rules did not change with the mood of the man enforcing them. In Germany, a woman could be praised one day and denounced the next. A supervisor's temper could become policy by noon. A shortage could become a sermon. Pain could be explained as duty. At Camp Harbor, a broken bunk was repaired because it was broken. A fever was treated because it was a fever. A name was used because it belonged to someone. That was the quiet violence of American order. It did not argue with Nazi propaganda. It made it look ridiculous. On the 4th evening, Lotte wrote her first letter home on paper, stamped by the camp office. "Dear Moody, I am alive. They gave us blankets. We eat every day. I know this will sound impossible, but the guards are correct with us. Not warm, not friendly exactly. Correct." She stopped there. The next sentence would not come. How could she tell her mother that captivity felt more orderly than freedom had? How could she admit that the people she had feared were feeding her better than the state she had obeyed? She folded the page unfinished. Across the room, a younger woman named Annalise was staring at the wash basin. "Do you think they are pretending?" she asked. "Pretending what? To be decent." Lotte looked toward the stove. A guard had just stepped inside to leave another bucket of coal. He did not stay, he did not stare, he set it down and left. "If they are pretending," Lotte said, "they are doing it even when nobody is watching." That sentence frightened her after she said it, because it was the beginning of trust, and trust was the one luxury none of them had been trained to survive. Then came the morning of the white packets. The women were lined up after breakfast when Nurse Marion Cole entered with 2 cardboard cartons under her arm. She was not much older than Lotte, with pinned brown hair, tired eyes, and a wool sweater under her medical coat. She spoke no German except for a few careful phrases, but she had learned to move slowly around women who expected suddenness to mean danger. The interpreter stood beside her. "These are for women's health," he said. Nobody understood. Nurse Cole opened one packet and held it flat in her gloved hand. The room changed. Confusion first, then embarrassment, then a sharp kind of silence. Freda looked away. Anneliese laughed once, too loudly, then covered her mouth. Greta Muller, the oldest among them, muttered, "Bandages?" The interpreter swallowed. "Sanitary napkins," he said, "for monthly bleeding." Several women stared at him as if he had used a forbidden word in church. Lotte felt heat rise into her face. In the factories, women had used rags washed in cold water, newspaper folded under work skirts, scraps from military packing cloth when they could steal it. Some women used nothing and learned to stand very still. In the last winter, Lotte had known a girl who developed a fever after using dirty cloth because the factory clinic had no clean supply and the foreman told her to stop being dramatic. The girl was back on the line 2 days later. She was gone by spring. Nurse Cole did not lower her voice. The interpreter spoke for her. "These are not luxuries. They prevent infection. They keep clothing clean. They help you work, rest, and stay healthy. If you need more, ask at the infirmary. If you need more, ask." Those 2 words were almost indecent. In the world Lotte came from, need had to justify itself, need had to kneel before the state, need had to become useful, patriotic, efficient, quiet. Here, a need had been anticipated before anyone dared speak it. One woman pushed the packet back toward the table. "We are prisoners," she said. "Why give this to us?" The interpreter translated. Nurse Cole listened and answered without softness. "Because prisoners are still women, and women are still people." The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Nobody cheered. Nobody thanked her. Nobody knew what to do with a mercy that exposed them. Lotte looked down at the packet again. It was white, clean, ordinary. That was the terrible part. It was ordinary here. It had not required a miracle. It had not required a speech from a leader. It had not required victory music or sacrifice posters. It required cotton, paper, supply, and the belief that women's bodies were not an embarrassment to be managed in secret. By that afternoon, the packet had traveled through the barracks like contraband truth. The younger women examined it in whispers. The older women pretended not to care, then asked practical questions when the nurse returned. Could it be changed during work hours? Would there be enough next month? Was it only for sickness? Would the guards know who requested it? Each answer made the room quieter. Yes, yes, no, no. No one would be marked for needing one. That night, Lotte unfolded the packet alone on her bunk. For years she had believed discomfort was proof of discipline. Hunger made you loyal. Pain made you strong. Silence made you respectable. Embarrassment made you clean. Now the enemy had placed a small object in her hand and made all of that sound like a lie told by people who never intended to suffer the way women suffered. Freda sat across from her, rubbing her thumb along the edge of her own packet. "My sister used newspaper after the raids," she said. She said the ink burned. Lotte closed her eyes. "Nobody should remember that sentence," she said. "But we do." The next week, Nurse Cole held a health talk in the mess room. Most of the women attended because they were curious. Some attended because they were angry. A few attended because they wanted to prove that American decency had a trick hidden under it. The nurse spoke about nutrition, infection, washing hands, boiling cloth when nothing else existed, and the danger of shame in medical matters. She did not speak like a priest. She did not flatter America. She did not call Germany barbaric. That restraint made the lesson harder to reject. "Neglect is not strength," she said through the interpreter. "A country can ask courage from people. But when it trains them to ignore preventable suffering, that is not courage anymore. That is waste. Waste." The word struck Lotte with physical force. Not sacrifice, not destiny, not womanly endurance. Waste. She thought of women in factory lines bleeding through thin skirts while supervisors called them lazy. She thought of mothers in basements tearing curtains into strips. She thought of the girls told to produce soldiers, produce shells, produce obedience, but never asked why the nation that demanded their bodies could not protect them. Across the room, Anneliese raised her hand. Her voice trembled. "Did American women have these during the war?" The nurse nodded. "Not always easily, not always perfectly, but they existed, and people understood the need." The room went still again, because scarcity they could understand, bombing they could understand, but being ignored on purpose was something else. Greta, who had lost 2 sons and 1 husband to the war, leaned forward. In Germany, she said, "They told us suffering made us noble." The interpreter repeated it. Nurse Cole looked at her for a long moment. Sometimes suffering only means someone with power decided not to care. That was the darkest lesson of Camp Harbor. Not that the Americans were kind. Kindness could be dismissed as personality. The darker lesson was that the Americans had built systems for small human needs. Food came by schedule. Blankets were counted. Illness was recorded. Mail was sorted. Work was paid in camp credit, even when the pay was small. Complaints were written down instead of treated as insults. None of it was perfect. The coffee was bad. The guards could be stiff. The fence was real. The women were not free. But the machinery of the place did not require humiliation to function. That discovery unsettled them more than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have confirmed everything. Decency forced revision. By mid-December, the women had started marking time by contradictions. The enemy fed them. The enemy called them by name. The enemy treated fever quickly. The enemy asked if the stove smoked too much. The enemy provided for a monthly cycle that their own government had treated as a private inconvenience. Every contradiction pressed against the same weak wall. What else had been a lie? One morning, a newspaper arrived in the camp library. It showed American cities crowded with Christmas shoppers, not untouched by grief but standing, lit, supplied, arguing in public about strikes, prices, elections, demobilization. Lotte stared at the photographs. She had been taught that democracies were soft, chaotic, and rotting. But the country that was supposed to be weak had crossed an ocean, defeated Germany, and still had enough cloth to give enemy women what they needed without being asked. That night, a guard named Private Ellis found her struggling over an English headline. He paused at the table. "Need help with that?" Lotte stiffened. He waited. When she did not answer, he pointed at the word. "Shortage," he said. "Means not enough." She repeated it. "Shortage." He nodded. Then he translated the sentence badly, laughed at himself, tried again, and left her with the newspaper. No lecture, no victory speech, no demand that she admire him. Just a word explained because she wanted to know it. In Germany, knowledge had been guarded by fear. Here, even a private with mud on his boots seemed to believe a prisoner could ask a question and remain a person. That simple freedom became dangerous. Questions multiplied. If Americans were animals, why did they follow written rules? If democracy was weakness, why had it endured the war? If obedience was the highest virtue, why had obedience produced rubble? If women's suffering was noble, why did relief feel so much like truth? The answers did not arrive all at once. They came through objects. A clean sheet, a repaired buckle, a letter delivered with the envelope intact, a spoonful of medicine, a white packet waiting quietly in a supply box. In January, the first letters from Germany reached the barracks. Lotte received one from her mother in Hamburg. The handwriting was smaller than she remembered. "The apartment is gone. Your sister and I sleep in a cellar with 6 others. There is no proper soap. The neighbor's child has a cough that will not leave. Do not worry for us if you can avoid it." Lotte read the letter 3 times. Then she hid behind the infirmary and wept so violently that Nurse Cole heard her from inside. She did not ask what was wrong. She only opened the door and handed Lotte a handkerchief. The gesture nearly broke her, because it was so small, because it was so unnecessary, because back home her mother had no soap, while Lotte had a clean handkerchief from the enemy. For 2 days she hated the packet. She hated its whiteness, its neatness, its proof. She hated that it had made her body safer while her mother's body weakened in a cellar. She hated that American supply wagons could deliver cotton to prisoners, while German leaders had delivered slogans to women standing in ruins. She hated that the object was not grand enough to contain the truth it carried. On the 3rd day, Greta found her sitting alone by the stove. "You think accepting it means thanking them," Greta said. Lotte did not look up. "Doesn't it?" "No," Greta said. "It means we finally know what should have been ours." That answer stayed with her. From then on, the sanitary packet stopped feeling like a gift. It became evidence. Not evidence that America was pure. Not evidence that every soldier was noble. Not evidence that war had become gentle. Evidence of something narrower and more devastating. A society revealed itself in what it considered basic. For one government, women's hidden suffering had been useful because silent suffering could be praised. For another, even a detained enemy woman's health was a supply problem to be solved. That difference did not erase the war. It explained why one side could win without needing to become what it had defeated. By February, the camp began formal discussion sessions. They were called orientation classes. The women called them the argument room. A civilian teacher came twice a week with newspapers, maps, and a battered booklet on American government. He was not charming. He sweated when challenged. His German was worse than Private Ellis's, but he did something no Nazi lecturer had ever done in front of them. He allowed interruption. Freda challenged him first. You say people are free to criticize leaders. But if criticism weakens the nation, why permit it? The teacher rubbed his forehead. Because leaders can be wrong. The interpreter repeated it. A small sound moved through the room. Not laughter. Disbelief. Leaders can be wrong. The sentence would have been dangerous in the Germany they knew. It would have carried neighbors, files, whispers, disappearance. Here it was the beginning of a lesson. The teacher went on. If the government fails, people must be able to say so. Otherwise the failure becomes permanent. Lotte thought of Nurse Cole saying neglect was waste. She saw the connection before she could name it. Health, speech, food, criticism, dignity. They were not separate kindnesses. They were all refusals to let power become untouchable. After class, she asked Private Ellis why American soldiers argued with officers. He looked confused by the question. We don't argue with orders in battle, he said. But if a thing is wrong, somebody better say it before it gets worse. Before it gets worse. That phrase cut into her. Germany had been built on letting things get worse as long as the order came from above. The women began to talk at night after lights out. Not loudly. Habit kept them careful. But the conversations changed. At first they had asked whether Americans were secretly cruel. Then they asked whether America was secretly foolish. By March they were asking whether Germany had been secretly broken long before the bombs proved it. Annalise said she used to feel proud when posters called women the steel heart of the nation. Now the phrase disgusted her. They called us steel, she whispered, so they did not have to notice when we bled. Nobody answered. Some lines are too true for comfort. When spring rain came, the camp yard turned soft and brown. The snow melted from the fence posts. Mud gathered under the laundry lines. The women worked in repair rooms, sorted uniforms, cleaned offices, sewed torn canvas, and learned more English by accident than by instruction. They also learned that American fairness was not sentimental. A woman who stole from another prisoner lost canteen privileges. A woman who refused work without medical reason was disciplined. A guard who mocked a prisoner was reported by another guard and removed from barracks duty. The rules had edges, but edges were different from cruelty. Edges could be seen. Cruelty changed shape whenever power wished. That distinction became one of the most important lessons of the camp. In April, repatriation lists were posted. The women gathered around them without speaking. Their names appeared in groups. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, Bremen, Kiel. Home was no longer an idea. It was a transport date. The barracks grew tense. Some women were desperate to return. Some feared what they would find. Others feared what they had become. Freda said it plainly one evening. What do we do with this knowledge in a country that has no room for it? Lotte knew what she meant. How do you tell a hungry mother that the enemy treated you well? How do you explain dignity to someone digging bricks out of a street? How do you carry a clean white packet into a cellar where people are still measuring life by potatoes? Nurse Cole seemed to understand without being told. A week before departure, she gathered the women in the mess room one last time. On the table sat several cartons, not one packet each, more. Enough for the journey, enough for the first month's home, enough for women who might have to share. The room went very still. Nurse Cole spoke carefully, and the interpreter followed. These are not favors. Take them because you may need them. Give them if someone else needs them more. Do not be ashamed to ask for care. Do not be ashamed to give it. Annalise began to cry first. Then Freda. Then a woman who had never cried once in the camp turned her face to the wall and shook silently. Lotte did not cry. She picked up one of the packets and pressed it flat in her palm. The paper felt thinner than memory. The supply clerk wrote down the number issued to each woman, as he did with blankets and rations. That almost made Lotte smile. Even the miracle had paperwork, but the paperwork mattered, because it meant dignity had been made administrative. It had been ordered, stocked, counted, protected from chance. That was what her own leaders had never done. They had made suffering poetic because poetry was cheaper than provision. They left Camp Harbor on a gray morning in May. The guards stood along the platform, awkward and quiet. No one knew what goodbye meant between enemies who had stopped hating each other in the proper way. Private Ellis gave Lotte a small English-German dictionary with his name written inside the cover. Keep asking things, he said. She nodded, unable to answer. Nurse Cole handed the final medical parcel to Greta, then shook each woman's hand. When she reached Lotte, she said, "You will know what to do with what you learned." Lotte wanted to say she was not sure. Instead, she said, "I hope so." The train pulled out slowly. The camp fence passed by the windows, then the infirmary, then the road, then the trees. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Each woman carried a parcel in her lap. Bread for the journey, papers, a little money in camp credit exchanged for cash, and the white packets. The smallest thing among them. The heaviest, Germany received them with rubble. Hamburg smelled of wet ash, sewage, and coal smoke. Walls stood without rooms behind them. Streets turned into paths through brick. People moved with the slow caution of those who had learned not to waste strength. Lotte found her mother in a basement beneath what had once been a bakery. The reunion was not the scene she had imagined. There was no dramatic embrace at first. Her mother stared at her coat, her face, the weight she had gained, the steadiness in her hands. "You look well," her mother said. The words were not accusation, but they were not simple either. Lotte set down her parcel. "The Americans fed us," she said. Her mother sat on an upturned crate. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Lotte opened the medical bundle, soap, bandage cloth, a small tin of ointment, and the white packets. Her younger sister Marta picked one up and frowned. "What is it?" Lotte looked at the object that had once confused her so completely. Now she understood it too well. "For us," she said. Marta's face tightened. "From them?" "Yes." Her mother closed her eyes, not in gratitude, not in anger, in exhaustion, because truth sometimes arrives when nobody has the strength to receive it. Over the next months, Lotte did not become a hero. That would have been too easy. She became useful. She helped women in the cellar boil cloth safely when supplies ran out. She translated instructions from American relief packages. She taught her sister the English words Private Ellis had taught her. She argued with a local official who tried to keep medical supplies locked for proper distribution, while women stood in line outside. For the first time in her life, she did not mistake obedience for goodness. When someone said sacrifice made women noble, Lotte asked who benefited from the sacrifice. When someone said suffering had been necessary, she asked which suffering had been preventable. When someone said the Americans had only acted kindly to humiliate Germany, she did not defend America as perfect. She held up the white packet and said, "Then why did our own people never fear humiliating us this way?" Years later, the women of Camp Harbor remembered different things. Greta remembered the first time a guard used her name. Freda remembered crying over beans because enough food felt impossible. Annalise remembered the sentence about leaders being wrong. Nurse Cole, in a letter written long after the camp closed, remembered the silence that followed the first distribution of sanitary supplies. But Lotte remembered the weight of the packet in her palm, how light it had been, how impossible, how it contained no ideology and defeated one anyway, because propaganda survives best in sealed rooms. It needs people to have no comparison, no counterexample, no ordinary proof that life could be arranged differently. A speech can be argued with, a poster can be torn down, a slogan can be replaced by another slogan, but a warm meal placed before a hungry prisoner is difficult to explain away. A letter delivered intact is difficult to explain away. A nurse saying, "Because prisoners are still women," is difficult to explain away. And a small white packet given without shame to someone taught she did not deserve such consideration can become more dangerous than a lecture. The women had entered the camp expecting punishment. What they found was something harder to survive, proof. Proof that power did not require cruelty. Proof that order did not require humiliation. Proof that dignity was not a reward for loyalty, nationality, usefulness, or obedience. It was the baseline from which a decent world began. They had arrived as prisoners of a country. They left as witnesses against a lie. The war had ended months earlier. But in one small white packet, the surrender finally reached the mind.